Rappers, welcome in to this weekend edition of our ATW, where the topic tonight is going to continue on with Islam, and specifically we're going to start talking about two of the Islamic dynasties, which in Islam, whenever we refer to the dynasties, we're actually going to substitute a new phrase or a new term called caliphate. What is a caliphate? It's essentially a dynasty, or you could think of it as a kingdom, or even an empire. That word is just it's interchangeable. Now, if you break down the word caliphate, a caliph is the leader, is the ruler of Islam. This is a historically, incredibly important topic, because the death of Muhammad created a controversy in Islam, and that controversy stemmed from the fact that Muhammad did not leave behind an heir to his growing Islamic dynasty that he created when he was alive. And when Muhammad died, he only had a daughter, and that begs the question, who was going to take over for the founder of Islam? And what really sparked just an incredible, and I mean a PSF, just past shapes the future. This is one of the most dynamic topics when it comes to Islam, and it's the divide between the two groups of Islam that split and fractured after the death of Muhammad. And there were some Muslims who believed that Muhammad's follower should be someone who was picked or chosen by Muhammad to rule, and that this leader should have, sort of be the best possible candidate that Muhammad would have suggested or selected had he been alive. And this particular group of Muslims are known as Sunni Muslims. So Sunnis argued that after Muhammad's death, it shouldn't matter if it's someone who's born to the same family or a blood relative of Muhammad, but that the rightful ruler or the rightful caliph of Islam should be whoever is best fit to rule. Sort of like a meritocracy type deal. And Sunnis developed, and they split off, and they sort of began to follow one of Muhammad's former generals, a guy named Abu Bakr, was one of the first caliphs of Islam after Muhammad's death. However, not all Muslims were in agreement over who should be the rightful heir or caliph of the religion. And those that argued that the rightful ruler or successor to Muhammad should be a blood relative, someone that came from the same family as Muhammad, are called Shia or Shiite. You might see it spelled Shia or Shiite. Now, this again is a fundamental difference. And essentially, because he didn't leave behind any sons, Shia or Shiite Muslims believe that the bloodlines and the right to rule should go through Muhammad's son-in-law, a man named Ali. Now, Ali was assassinated shortly after Muhammad's death, but regardless, Shia believed that, and that's how you can kind of remember Ali. The term Shia actually was broken down from Ali's name, and that's where it derived the name. Literally means party of Ali. And so what really began to divide Muslims was this disagreement. And I know this may seem like, okay, that's normal, right? Disagreement over who should be the rightful ruler. But the long-term consequences of the Sunni and Shia split is the fact that to this day, this is one of the most incredible divides in all of world religion. Sunni and Shia are still to this day fighting over their beliefs as to who the rightful ruler of Islam is, the rightful caliph. Now, when it comes to the beliefs of Islam, they're roughly the same. I mean, really, and I'm not going to go too in depth here. That's not the point. You should have a fundamental difference, though, about the belief over who should have been the caliph. The rightful heir, according to Shia, which was someone from Muhammad's son-in-law's bloodlines, or as the Sunni believed, just whoever was best fit to rule. The consequences of this, though, this continues on, as I mentioned, and around the world today, Sunnis are the dominant group of Muslims. The world population of Sunnis is around 1.5 billion. So roughly about 85 to 90% of Muslims are Sunni. And so Sunnis are the majority. Shia are much in the minority. But wars around the world have been fought over this divide. Probably the best case example was in the 1980s. Iran, which is a heavily Shia country, or the country of Iran, the old Persian Empire. Iran and Iraq, their neighbors to the west, which is where Mesopotamia came from. And in the 1980s, they fought a bloody war between Sunni and Shia. And oftentimes what happens as a result of the divide between Sunni and Shia, you get internal conflict in countries where you have a Sunni majority population ruling over a Shia minority population. That can create incredible religious tension in those countries. And it's really just something to be aware of as we move forward, out of the post-classical era. It's great PSF for us to really take into consideration. Now, just like today, Sunnis tend to be in the majority, and that's what was the case back at the time of the 700s CE, where our post-classical era kind of begins. And the first of these caliphates that I want to get into that was a Sunni caliphate were the Ummayad Caliphate. And the Umayyads branched out shortly after Muhammad's death, and the Umayyads are going to expand Islam into Afro-Eurasia in a way that very few people ever would have thought possible for Muhammad's founding of the religion. What the Umayyads are best known for is spreading Islam into North Africa. They conquered almost all of North Africa, and they did this thanks in part to not only their military might, but also trade. We emphasized on Friday in the quiz, how trade, Islam really promoted trade and merchant activity. So the Sunni rulers of the Umayyad Caliphate really promoted trade across the Sahara Desert, and they used the Sahara Desert trade routes to really solidify their base of operations in North Africa. And like it said in the reading, Islam didn't force people to convert. It was very tolerant of local customs. It appealed to all sorts of different classes, lower class, women, upper class, elites. And so the Umayyads just scooped up almost all of North Africa. Meanwhile, the Umayyads are also incredibly significant for spreading Islam into Europe. And this is one of the most important points that came out of the reading, which is that the Umayyad dynasty conquered most of Spain. And we often don't think of Islam as a dominant religion in Europe, although it certainly has a presence there to this day. And from around the mid-700s, Islam will be a part of Spanish and European history for almost 700 years, until the 1490s, when Muslims were finally expelled out of Spain. The conquest of Spain sent shockwaves around Europe. And keep in mind, none of that would have been possible, perhaps, if it wasn't for the fall of the Roman Empire. With the fall of the Roman Empire, that opened up the door for Muslims and Islam to spread into Europe. And for 700 years, Islam strongly influenced Europe. And the ways that Islam influenced Europe, the reading really picked up on this. Architecture, and we're going to look at some photos of that in class. I really want to talk about the cultural exchange in class. So I'm just going to stick to the idea that Islam spread to Spain. We'll go over some stuff in class, and I even have some visuals, some great visuals, and some other multimedia to show you. They were not able to invade into France, where a French king named Charles Martel, a.k.a. Charles the Hammer, that was his nickname. Hey, Willis, there was a smile. Okay. So Charles Martel kept the Muslims out of France, but Muslim culture thrived in Spain for 700 years. But the Umayyad rule didn't last terribly long. In fact, the Umayyads were in power up to about the midpoint of the 700s, and that's when eventually the Umayyad dynasty caliphate fell, and a new caliphate rose, and that would be the Abbasid Caliphate. And the Abbasids led a rebellion. Like all empires, they rise, they fall. The Umayyad was ultimately overthrown, and here comes another dynasty that's going to push Islam further and further into the world. And the Abbasids are interesting because the Abbasids were actually both had part Sunni and Shia rule, so they were like a dueling Islamic caliphate in this sense. And the Abbasids are best known. I would say what you guys most want to know about the Abbasids is that in the early part of their rule, they were the golden age of Islam. This was the most prosperous point of Islamic rule where culture and prosperity were flowing. The Abbasids are typically associated with the golden age of Islam, and they ruled all the way into the 1200s through much of the Middle East. Of course, Arabia was the home base, and North Africa had been conquered by the Ummayyads. But the Abbasids pushed further east, and they went as far into Central Asia, and also conquered large parts of Persia, which fell under Islamic rule. And we're talking here about a 500-year caliphate that spread Islam and really offered the world some of great Islamic culture. In fact, Arabian Nights, one of the most famous Islamic academic and intellectual achievements, was written during the Abbasid Caliphate. Mathematical principles came out of the Abbasid Caliphate. So when we think of the Abbasids, it's really thinking about that golden age. But it also reinforces just how important the spread of Islam was. And this ties back things like the Sufi missionaries. This ties back to trade routes in the Indian Ocean, spreading Islam down into East Africa along the Swahili coast. And then ultimately, of course, Islam spread through diaspora communities all the way to Southeast Asia. And this all primarily happened during the rule of the Abbasids. And I want to just end with one more caliphate, although there's a new word to throw at you, and it was on the quiz, and that's the Delhi Sultanate. A sultanate is another word that sometimes is substituted for caliphate. And what's notable of the Delhi Sultanate, we're going to keep it really brief here because I'm also out of time. The Delhi Sultanate was the first group of Muslims who spread into India. Islam ventured into India around the 1200s. That's when the Delhi Sultanate was around. And the Delhi Sultanate were Muslims that came from Central Asia, which, of course, the Abbasids had pushed a lot of Islam into Central Asia. So there's a connection between all these Muslim caliphates. And for the three we covered, the Ummayyad, the number one thing to remember about the Ummayyad is the expansion into North Africa and Spain. With the Abbasids, it's the cultural diffusion, and it's the spread of Islamic culture during the Golden Age. And with the Delhi Sultanate, our third one, it's really all about spreading Islam into South Asia, where it's going to take root, and later on we'll come back to Islam in South Asia when we talk about other empires and the caliphates. So we talk about the Sunni and Shia split, while at the same time covering three important post-classical era caliphates. And we will press on with Islam and wrap Islam up for now on Monday. Heavy emphasis on trade and culture development, and giving you some cool examples to remember. So that's about it from today. I made sure to smile. I made sure to make this hopefully engaging and entertaining. And as you know, the past shapes the future. Have a great weekend, Whappers, and I will see you on Monday. Goodbye.